In 1947, a construction crew in Long Island finished a house every 15 minutes. Not a typo, 15 minutes, start to finish, over and over, all day, every day for years. The company doing it split house building into 27 separate steps and moved crews down the line like a factory floor. Except the product rolling off the line was somebody's entire future home. That single project would end up defining what home meant for most of the following century in America, and almost nobody involved in building it was trying to invent the suburbs. They were trying to solve a housing shortage. The suburbs were just what came out the other end. Picture the scale of it for a second. Not one house built in 15 minutes, but a new one, finished and move-in ready. Every 15 minutes, continuously, for years, until nearly 1,700 of them existed where there had been nothing but farmland a few years earlier. Nothing about American housing before this had ever worked at that speed. And the speed itself is exactly why almost nobody stopped to ask what kind of country all those identical houses would eventually add up to. Here's the important part. This wasn't one company's marketing gimmick that happened to catch on. It was the collision of a genuine housing crisis, a wave of federal programs designed to solve it, and a set of quiet rules buried inside those programs that decided, on purpose, who would get access to that new American dream and who wouldn't. None of it happened by pure accident in the sense of nobody planning anything, but the specific shape it ended up taking. Endless single-family subdivisions, a sharp racial line running underneath all of it, and a country rebuilt so thoroughly around that model that it's now hard to imagine anything else. That part really was an accident nobody fully intended. Beat. The problem. Nowhere to live. When American soldiers came home from World War II, they walked into a housing shortage almost impossible to picture today. An estimated 6 million people were crammed into relatives' basements, attics, and garages. Families were living in converted Quonset huts, retired trolley cars, and, in a few genuinely desperate cases, department store windows set up for public sympathy. A 1947 Senate report on the crisis described veterans living in chicken coops, tool sheds, and smokehouses, and didn't mince words, calling those conditions an insult to the people who just fought a war. The federal government had already built part of the machinery to fix this, almost by accident over a decade earlier. During the Depression, mass foreclosures, over 1,000 a day at the worst point, pushed FDR's New Deal to create the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which invented something that sounds boring but changed everything. The modern amortized mortgage paid off gradually over 20 or 30 years, instead of the old 5-year loans that ended in one crushing final payment. Then, in 1934, the Federal Housing Administration was created to insure those long mortgages, protecting banks from losses and making lenders far more willing to hand out loans in the first place. Neither program was built with the suburbs in mind. They were built to stabilize a broken housing market. But they quietly created the financial plumbing that made what came next possible. Before any of this, buying a home meant putting down more than half its value in cash up front, a bar so high that home ownership was mostly reserved for families who were already financially comfortable. The amortized, insured, low-down payment mortgage was a genuinely radical shift in who got to participate in that market at all. It didn't cause the suburbs by itself, but without it, nothing that happened next in Levittown or anywhere like it would have been financially possible for the working-class families who actually moved in. Beat. The GI Bill lit the fuse. In 1944, Congress passed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, the GI Bill, offering veterans a startling deal: a federally guaranteed home loan with little or no down payment and favorable interest rates, on top of college tuition and unemployment support. For the first time, homeownership stopped being something only the comfortably established could afford and became available to millions of working-class families who'd never have qualified for a traditional mortgage before. Demand exploded overnight, and one builder in particular was ready for it. William Levitt had spent the war building housing for defense workers using assembly line techniques borrowed straight from wartime manufacturing. He took that same method, bought 4,000 acres of Long Island farmland, the largest private housing project in the country at the time, and started building what would become Levittown. Nearly 1,700 nearly identical houses, built at a rate of about 150 per week. Cheap enough that a veteran could move in for $0 down and roughly $60 a month. Some residents reportedly walked into the wrong house by mistake at night because every single one on the block looked exactly the same. It worked spectacularly. The suburban share of the U.S. population jumped from under 20% in 1940 to over 30% by 1960. Homeownership rates climbed from 44% to nearly 62% over the same stretch. Builders across the entire country copied the Levitt formula almost exactly, and by the mid-1950s, the vast majority of new home construction in America was happening in suburbs that didn't exist a decade earlier. Critics noticed the strangeness of it almost immediately, even at the time. One writer in Harper's called Levittown American suburbia reduced to its logical absurdity. The urban critic Lewis Mumford described it as a uniform environment from which escape was impossible. Levitt himself wasn't especially bothered by the criticism. He reportedly liked to say that no man who owned his own house and yard could ever really become a communist, treating the entire project as much as an ideological statement about stability and property as a housing solution. Whatever you make of that framing, it worked as marketing. Buyers showed up by the thousands, and the waiting list stretched for months. Beat. The part that wasn't an accident at all. Here's where the story stops being a happy tale about ingenuity solving a housing crisis. The Federal Housing Administration didn't just insure mortgages. It published an underwriting manual instructing appraisers to treat racially mixed neighborhoods as financial risks, explicitly recommending against insuring loans in areas where what the manual called incompatible racial groups lived near each other. Government agencies drew color-coded maps of nearly every American city, marking neighborhoods with any significant black population in red. The literal origin of the term redlining, as too risky to insure, regardless of the actual creditworthiness of the people living there. Levittown itself enforced this directly. Deeds on the original homes contained clauses explicitly barring resale to black families, enforceable by lawsuit from any neighbor who objected, legal without exception, until the Supreme Court struck down enforcement of these covenants in 1948 and still functionally practiced by developers and lenders for decades afterward. The Veterans Administration, running the GI Bill's housing benefit, adopted the same FHA racial exclusions when insuring loans for returning soldiers. Roughly 60% of black veterans, meanwhile, had already been given dishonorable discharges disproportionately compared to white veterans, which alone disqualified them from GI Bill benefits regardless of their service record. The single largest wealth-building tool the federal government had ever created was by explicit written policy, mostly unavailable to the very people who might have needed it most. The financial consequences compounded for generations. Those original Levittown homes sold for roughly twice the national median income in the late 1940s, genuinely affordable to a working-class family. Today, homes in that same development sell for 6 to 8 times median income, having appreciated in value for 80 years while the families locked out of buying them in 1947 never got to accumulate any of that equity at all. When the Fair Housing Act finally banned this kind of discrimination in 1968, the houses that had been affordable to lock out an entire generation of black families were, by then, no longer affordable to anyone trying to catch up. It's worth sitting with exactly why that gap never closed. Homeownership isn't just shelter. For most American families, it's the single largest source of household wealth, passed down through inheritance and used as collateral to start businesses or pay for children's education. A family that bought into Levittown in 1947 for $7,000 wasn't just buying a house. They were buying 8 decades of appreciating equity that could later fund a grandchild's tuition or a down payment on their own home. A family barred from buying that same house never got access to that compounding at all. And the wealth gap that decision created shows up measurably in household wealth statistics between white and black American families today, generations after the actual redlining map stopped being drawn. Beat. What the new shape of the country actually looked like. Once the model took hold, everything downstream got built to match it. Highways followed the new suburban commuters outward from city centers, which we've covered before, but the suburbs came first, and the highways were arguably built to serve a settlement pattern the federal government had already spent over a decade subsidizing into existence. Shopping centers, schools, and entire local tax bases reorganized themselves around the assumption that Americans now lived spread out in single-family houses, reachable primarily by car. Zoning codes across the country locked the pattern in permanently, restricting enormous swaths of land to nothing but the exact kind of detached single-family house Levitt had perfected. No apartments, no duplexes, no small mixed-use buildings allowed anywhere near it. None of the individual pieces here were secretly, cynically engineered from day one to produce car-dependent sprawl and a permanent racial wealth gap 8 decades later. A genuine housing crisis needed genuinely fast solutions, and mass production genuinely delivered homes to millions of families who badly needed them. But underneath the speed and the ingenuity sat a set of quiet administrative rules. Who counts as a safe credit risk? Which neighborhoods get colored red on a map? Whose deed gets a clause forbidding resale? And those quiet rules turned out to matter more in the long run than the assembly line itself. The suburbs weren't a plot. They were a shortcut that solved one emergency while manufacturing a much slower, much longer one that the country is, in a lot of ways, still living inside of. Drive through almost any American metro area today, and you're driving through the physical residue of that shortcut. Subdivisions of similar houses, neighborhoods sorted by income, and often still quietly by race, an entire built environment shaped by underwriting decisions made by people who are long dead, in offices that no longer exist, using maps that technically stopped being official policy nearly 60 years ago. The paperwork expired. The geography it produced didn't. Beat. If a house built every 15 minutes just rewired how you think about your own neighborhood, send this to someone who's never asked why their street looks exactly like the one next to it. And subscribe. Every week, another piece of the world that turns out to have been decided for you long before you got here.